Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. If you're building furniture or cabinets and you want to up it a little bit, a nice way of doing that is to use something called a stop dado. That's where you don't see the joint come through to the surface. I like to do it on something like this. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help you take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, be sure to subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and don't forget to turn on the notification on your mobile device so you'll know every time we release a new video. Good? All right, back to the bench. So let's take this just a little bit further, and you'll appreciate this if you're new to it. If you're going to build anything that has drawers in it, in this case a chest of drawers, you have to have something that's going to support the drawers. Now on the cheaper furniture, you typically just have drawer guides on either side, but that's also the stuff that doesn't last very long. If you look at the furniture that has been around long enough to be called an antique, it usually has some kind of a framework that makes the carcass, in other words the box minus the drawers, nice and strong, it doesn't rack, and that's what makes it through the generations. So if I pull out this drawer, show you exactly what I'm talking about. We have several horizontal pieces that are attached to both of the vertical pieces to make for a strong joint. And what we're talking about today is using that dado joint. I'm going to explain exactly what it is, but this is where it would be used, cut into this panel, and that's what allows this piece to stay exactly where you want it for all of that time. And we're going to talk about how it's going to look out here. That's why we use something called a stop dado instead of a regular dado. All right, let me show you what the difference is between a regular dado and a stop dado. So here's your dado, trench, housing, whatever you want to call it. It's cut across the grain. It's the width of this piece, which would be your divider that your drawer runs on. So what I don't think looks appropriate is to have the dado come all the way out. You actually see it. Even if it's nice and neat, it almost looks like, probably shouldn't see that. So a stop dado, we wouldn't allow this to come all the way through. So if you can envision having a piece sitting on there, like so, your dado now has stopped, does not come all the way through to the front, and then you notch the divider so that when it sits in there, it covers the dado. I always like to have it offset a little bit so that it doesn't look like a miss, and that looks much neater and more finished. So on this little one drawer box, the dado has been cut, stopped back probably a quarter of an inch, maybe 5/16 of an inch from the edge. This horizontal piece has had that little notch in it, set back just so that it looks like there's enough of an offset that it looks to be on purpose. And that is what I consider a little nice way to dress up casework. I'm going to go through the layout, at least how I would do it. And again, I'm looking at doing it like this, where the horizontal piece is set back from the vertical piece. I just think it looks so much better. I built this piece 30 some odd years ago, and the hassle of trying to flushing this up to that and having to go in any kind of a treatment that you have, it's just more difficult than it needed to be. So this is the easier one. To lay this out, obviously you're going to have already decided on the depth of each drawer, and you would do accordingly. So for right now, I'm just going to put a mark across here. Now, we can cut a dado that's the exact width of the piece. The problem is to get the perfect fit over the entire width of the horizontal piece means it's got to be the exact same width. And even on plywood, that's going to vary somewhat. So you try to get it perfect here and you get a gap here. So what I prefer to do is put a shoulder on both sides. So if this material is 13/16, then a 1/16 inch shoulder is all I need. I'm going to go ahead and lay this out so that my dado is going to be, let's say 11/16 wide. I'm going to run that all the way to the back. We're dealing in solid wood. We would treat plywood a little bit differently. On the back, I don't care. We can let it run wild. I want to stop it on the front. I don't want it coming all the way through. And Now it's just a matter of putting this on and deciding where we want it to stop. Do we want it almost back in here quite a bit? I'm going to stay on something this wide right about here. I need to have a little bit of a shoulder on the end of that horizontal piece. So we'll actually stop the dado maybe right about here. So we'll just put a mark on there. Doesn't need to be perfectly parallel to the front edge. So this is where we're going to stop the dado. How deep? Well, depends on how thick your piece is. You really only are worried about shear strength, but in this case, we actually want the fact that that is going to be glued in there to be part of the reason why it doesn't rack. This is a 13/16 inch piece. I'm going to say we can go a 1/4 of an inch. So we'll make this a 1/4 of an inch deep. Now, we're going to go over and set up the dado head on the table saw. I'll show you exactly how that is. And then we've got to make it so that we can stop it right here. But just so that we're doing both sides, because you do it a little bit differently, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And it's just going to mean that our operation on how we stop and start the dado is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to take that same layout and I'm going to put it over here. So this is what's called a stacked dado. This is what I prefer. There's a wobble type, but I don't like it. We actually did a video on this, so we'll leave a link below. But I'm going to, I want to cut 11/16. So you've got your two outside cutters that are 1/8 of an inch each. You've got these ones that are 1/8 of an inch. So those two would be 1/4. This would be 3/8. This would be a 1/2 inch. Try not to bang them.
Flip it.
Try to put them in the right direction too. What am I at? 1/2 inch. This is 5/8. And this little 1/16 inch one would give us our 11/16. So there's a spot that they have to be placed, and we'll stack them on there one time. But just the only thing you want to make sure you do is that when you put those stacked dados on, the fact that the teeth stick out beyond the plate, you have to make sure that it's sitting in that wide spot. If you look around the perimeter of the blade, there's just 2 wide spots opposite of each other, and that's where you set those ones. And then just make sure when you put the next one on that you don't have it sitting on top of anything, so it doesn't really matter where it is. It's going to clear the outside plate, and then do the same thing with the last one. Okay, I need to set that for 1/4 of an inch. Now I have it marked on my hand wheel that where 1/4 of an inch is approximately, and we'll just double check it. Make sure when you do this, don't use small scraps. That's where people get into trouble. Use something big enough that it's got a bit of mass to it. That's just about right. Could be a little bit more. There. I'm going to finish it off with a router plane anyway to make it deadly accurate. Okay. You need to have a miter gauge to support the work, particularly when you're doing what we're about to do. So I'm going to measure from the end to that line 6 5/16. That's 6 5/16. Now I need to know where the blade first starts to make contact, so I'll just spin it by hand. So right there. And then I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to draw a line on my fence. And that represents where the dado first starts to cut. And I'll go on the back side and do the same thing. I may easily race off for the next time. Now, instead of using two pieces of wood, I did one on one side, one on the other, which would represent the right side of your cabinet and the left side of your cabinet. So as not to confuse. We'll do the easy one first. So I'm going to cut from the back, and I'm going to stop right there. So on the end of my board, I'm going to measure this, which is a strong quarter. So I'll put a mark right there. So I'm going to cut until that line and this line align, and at that point I'll stop. Just a caution. When you're ripping with a single blade, there's a fair bit of resistance. Well, for every extra blade you have in here, you multiply that amount of resistance. So there's a lot of force pushing the wood in this direction. And folks get into trouble because they don't seem to realize that. Dado stacks can be extremely dangerous, but if you do it right, it's no worse than a table saw blade. So I'm going to fully aware of that. I'm going to hold it securely to my miter gauge. I'm going to keep it tight to my fence. So I know I've already got that set up where I need to. I'll fire this up, hold this securely, and I'm watching for that line to align with that first one. Keep it tight to the table. Now the nice thing about this saw, I can reach with my knee and shut it off. It's a little safer than trying to back it out. If we look at that, we're actually just about there. In fact, we're actually not even right on. I gotta check my numbers again. No, I didn't do that carefully. I'm actually closer to 6 1/4 than to 6 5/16, but we'll pretend it's in the right spot. Now the next one, when we do this side, we've got to drop it down onto the dado head and then proceed. That's a little bit more risky just because you're going to drop that down in. So what I prefer to do is actually have some kind of a stop. So if we put we're going to put our mark on here first. And then line that up. So now we're using the far side where the cutter stops cutting on the opposite side. I'm going to put a stop on here. I'm going to clamp it onto my fence. Now I do this because I've seen folks get into trouble as they drop that down, and that has a tendency to want to pull it in, and in doing so it gives you quite a jolt. Well, if I got this on here, it can't go anywhere. I like to be able to control that all the way down. So you kind of have to have your fingers in such a way that they're not getting trapped between the board and the table, yet you're still keeping pretty good control. So we'll fire it up. Tight to the marking gauge, to the miter gauge, tight to the fence, tight to my stop block, and just ease that in. A little closer to where we wanted it. So that would represent one side, this would represent the other side. Now we've got to go in and we've got to treat that just because I want to be able to gain this much space. The shape of the saw blade is round, obviously. So you've got your depth here, but then at this point it starts to slope up till you have nothing up here. If you put your second piece in, your horizontal piece, it doesn't give you any real glue surface in here, but we can fix all of that. Remember, we're building furniture, so we're going to be really careful. I'm going to take the extra time it takes to get this perfect. So I'm going to clamp this in place, make it down tight. I want to make sure that this depth is the same from front to back. I would have this already finished plane that is. I'm going to use my router plane to set that depth. And the reason why I want it to be critical, because I'm going to cut the shoulder or lay out the shoulder on the horizontal piece from this depth, and I'll show you how we do that. But I've got to be able to finish this. And what I'm doing is just, I'm gaining a little more reference surface for that horizontal piece so that it's well supported right up as close to the end of the board as I can instead of stopping back here somewhere. So we'll just go in, lay that tight against the side of those shoulders, and just finish that. And then we'll just sneak up on that line. And that's a lot of material to remove with the router plane, so I'll come in with my chisel. Remember, you have to give space or room for that chip to move. You can't just set it in that line and start pounding on it. There's a good chance you may cause something to split. So as long as you're removing some of the material behind it, then as you sneak up on it, the pressure on the bevel is less, the bevel of the chisel that is, and you're able to do that without it pushing back on you. This is pine, so I can actually do this just by hand. And I'm not trying to take that to full depth just yet. I'll do that later with the router plane. Want to make sure that the sides are cut. Makes removing the material a lot easier. And I can just kind of feel down here that I still am a ways away from reaching the bottom. Okay, I've added an extra fence or base to my router plane. Just gives a little more control, moves nicely. So I'm going to come back here. I like to keep that set with that locking screw just tight enough so that this doesn't drop. It goes down there with some control. And whatever depth I use here, I've got to use it on all the dados all the way around. So you want to make sure you're measuring off of the lower one, or at least taking it down so that you're not going to end up having one somewhere that's deeper and then you got to come back and redo all of them. So I'll just keep moving that until my cutter starts to pick up some material. Okay, at that point, I'll snug that locking screw up. Go right down the middle first. There's a little too much material there, so I'll come back and do that with the chisel. What I love about this tool is the level of accuracy and the amount of control that it affords you. So I'm just going to rough out about 90% of the material so that the router plane is just coming in and trimming it. One more check with the router plane so we can go right into that corner. Okay, so I'm confident that that depth is uniform front to back, including right up here at the front. Time to do the horizontal piece. Now this has got to have a small, shallow shoulder all the way on both sides that will cover the actual dado and just give us a nice, neat look. And then we need to have a little more cut here in the front so that it'll land wherever we want it to land, about 1/8 of an inch back. So slight notch up there. So what we need to know is how deep is this, because however deep this is, that's how much of this tongue we have to have protruding into here. Otherwise, we want to have the shoulders make contact at the same time the bottom of this is making contact down here. And believe it or not, you can go back and check the video we did, and gluing end grain to long grain is actually a very strong joint and surprisingly strong. So I want to take advantage of that. So I'm going to take my marking gauge, and this has a flat, nice sharp cutter. Flat here, the screw is sitting below so it doesn't interfere. And I can set that down now and drop that down and lock it in place. Now that measures very accurately the depth, and I can then use that setting to create my shoulder line on both faces and out here on the end. And this is where you want a nice deep cut. It's going to make the work a little bit easier. Now I prefer to go and do that on the table saw, not with the dado head, because it's a very small cut I'm making, and the dado head doesn't leave a nice flat bottom when it cuts. It has those little horns. But with my table saw blade and a rip blade in there, I can get a nice square shouldered cut, and it'd be an easy process of going in and cutting that to fit into there. We may use a little bit of trimming by hand, but we'll do the bulk of it on the table saw.
Okay,
To do this process more accurately, I have a fence, or a sleeve that fits on my fence, and we did a video on this. We'll leave a link to that too. What it's going to do is allow me greater stability when I'm making a pass like this. And of course you have two options. You can either leave the blade on the outside as you try to make that cut. However, if you make a mistake or anything happens, you're going to remove material. If instead you have the sleeve cover part of the blade, now if you make a mistake, you leave a bump, you go back and you remove it. Now, before I go any farther, I want to make sure that this is standing square to the table, and it's not quite, so I'm just going to raise it up slightly right here. I'll lower this one a little bit and raise this one a bit more. Okay, that looks good. That's locked down. Now I've got to lower my blade, move my fence over, and then wind that up into. This is a sacrificial piece. It can be replaced. Now I'm going to use the scrap until I get the height just right. In fact, I'll take my marking gauge . Okay, I can clean up that little bit. I'd rather have just a little bit left that I can clean up with the marking gauge instead of risk going beyond it. Now what we need to do is get the position of the fence left or right so that I'm taking off enough off that shoulder. Remember, whatever amount you move this to the left, it's going to take off twice as much because you're going to make a pass on both sides. That's a little bit tight. That's still just a bit snug. Before I do that second side, okay, I think I can, yeah, I can go in and do the other side. Now that seems like a nice snug fit, but if you're trying to put together a case that's got 4 or 5 of these and you're doing both sides, that would be just a little bit too tight. And the reason that didn't go all the way down, I still have to remove a little bit of material. I'm going to try raising that blade just a little bit. I don't mind taking the extra time to dial this in so that it fits as close as I can possibly get it. Okay. Now there's just a little bit of material left in there, so if you've got a good sharp marking gauge, you can go in there and just peel that away with a couple of passes. That's so much faster than trying to use a shoulder plane or even a chisel. Be careful to keep the head of the tool tight to the end of the board. Now we need to go in and just remove as much of that as we need to. And if we want to have about 1/8 of an inch, so I'm only going to take off about 1/8 of an inch. And this being such a soft wood, I can do that either by saw or I can do it with just the chisel alone. Just take my chisel and cut in the waist to give myself a little wall. Set my cross cut in there. Not a very deep cut. And there's no need to chisel that out, no need to saw that out. That can easily come out with a chisel. Now, last thing we want to do is just get rid of that little bit of debris that remained from the marking gauge. And that's not a very big shoulder, but its primary function is to just hide the dado. Make sure it's nice and clean. Make sure this one's nice and clean. And see how that fits. Now I'm going to put a clamp on that. When you're clamping a carcass like this, you want to make sure that the clamps align, in this case with this vertical piece, so that the pressure is applied and it's not pulling anything out of square. Now, we'll look in there and see if we've got a nice tight joint. We're tight along here, we're tight along here, and we're tight along the bottom. You don't need a lot of glue, but I would glue the bottom of the dado. I would put a little bit on the sides. I wouldn't put any at all on this. If you do, it's only going to get pushed off, and then you're going to have to go in here and get rid of glue. So just carefully, a thin layer all along here, along these walls, put that in, and you'd be surprised how strong that is. That's what you call a stop dado. Of course, before you do this, you'd want to finish both the surfaces of the horizontal piece and the inside surface of the vertical piece so that you're not having to sand or work into a corner. So much nicer to do that before it's assembled. So there's your stop dado. Great way to make a chest of drawers and just to dial your craftsmanship up a couple of notches. Good luck with that. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.